I guess we can start with that conversation. What's the latest you're hearing on the GM search here?
Nick, not much. I think it's one of those things. It was such a bombshell on Friday, and I think everyone had sort of already scribbled down some notes, like, "Hey, what about this guy, or this guy?" Getting together their own sort of list on the back of a napkin. That I think it's. I don't want to say it's been slow moving. I think it's obvious that they've been in contact with Brad Treliving. I don't have a real good sense of where they're at in the process. Have they begun the formal interview stage? Are they still gathering their list? I think it's a little bit slow to this point, but to be expected. We're exactly 1 week away from them parting ways with their general manager. So, to expect that someone would be in the chair already, I think is probably a little bit crazy.
Yeah, you're right. I think to me it's just fascinating that there's only been one true name that's sort of surfaced, and that's been sticking clear the last week, right? Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but like if you were to handicap things right now from everything you hear, is like Brad Treliving obviously a high person of interest in this scenario?
Yeah, I think honestly, I have a hard time envisioning many other candidates. Like if the mandate truly is to get someone that has experience in the job, to think of some of the others that have been out there and had experience, their resume isn't really all that impressive. Like let's take someone, sort of fresh experience in Ron Hextall and say, okay, he has experience, but is he a candidate? And the answer is no. He just ruined 2 teams on either side of Pennsylvania. So take him off the list. He essentially takes himself off the list. Like you can go through, some of the other managers that are now in advisory roles, Bob Murray in Calgary, or Dean Lombardi in Philadelphia, or Ray Shero in Minnesota. Like you can go through the entire list, and not to say that they're not experienced or not candidates. It's just I don't think sort of what they have on their resume quite looks as good in terms of all the boxes that Brad Treliving checks. So not to say that other people won't be interviewed. Of course they will. The best way to frame his candidacy is I think he's the odds-on favorite.
It's just interesting again because it is the Toronto Maple Leafs, and you would think a lot of people want this gig. So I started to wonder right off the bat on Friday when we heard the news if people would come out of the woodworks. And the name that started to surface in the last 24 hours, I know some Carlo Koliakovo of TSN 1050 in Toronto. The name Jim Nill, I believe he's got 1 year left on his contract. What's the chances that maybe that comes to fruition?
I mean, look, never say never, but I would say an incredibly small percentage. The last conversation that I had with Jim Nill, I guess going back to last year's draft, just caught up with him after the GM meetings, and we were actually talking about his contract, and he said that he got a 1 year extension, and I said, "That's interesting. 1 year, like, are you okay with that?" He said, "No, I actually asked for it." He said, "With this stage in my life, I'm getting close to retirement. 1 year, having that guaranteed is plenty enough for me." So he seemed to be very content with the spot that he was in, and obviously the Stars have had success. But to think that he's going to sort of step away from that, which seems unlikely. If anything, he's going to keep working. I think he's in a spot where he probably if anything, stays in Dallas. So I would say quite a bit of a long shot. And so you were asking me who I think are some other names. I mean, I think the list is some of the other names that we've heard pop up in some other markets. I would imagine that at some point the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to be speaking to Jason Botterill, Peter Chiarelli, Marc Bergevin. Like, go through the list of guys that have recent NHL experience, and you can kind of draw up your list from there.
At the very least, it sounds like they're doing their due diligence, I should say, and not rushing this process along again because we're a week into things. Everything went down last Friday. What did you make of the report from the other day about Brendan Shanahan coming out when he made the decision to move on or part ways from Kyle Dubas, whatever way you want to phrase it, that he pretty much went to the core four, the top 4 players in the team, whatever you want to call them, and said, "Hey, you don't have to worry about being moved." Is that just lip service, in your opinion?
I personally don't know how the president of the team can make such a declarative statement, especially without knowing who his general manager is. What is that person's vision? unless this kind of goes back to the same exact conversation that we were having last week about Kyle Dubas, and the plan really isn't to give this person any autonomy, and the president is already coming in and making the decision. That would seem to be a real negative for the position. So I don't think that that would be the case. And more than that, not to say it didn't happen, I'm just curious as to when exactly it happened. Brendan Shanahan, just for a matter of fact, was not in the exit interviews. The only people that were in the room were Kyle Dubas and I believe Sheldon Keefe. So I don't think there was anything, again, not to say it didn't happen, but to think that there's some kind of declarative statement made without a GM in place doesn't make sense to me. And let's color it with some experience too, like having been around for a while and seen and heard some of these conversations. Like I've been in situations where I've heard a general manager tell a player he's not going to be traded 24 hours before it happens, sitting in a chair right in front of him in his office. Things happen all the time. And I think if that was a conversation that took place, it was probably one of those ones to just calm everyone down and then readdress it from there. I mean, what's the very worst thing that happens? Someone calls you a liar after the fact. It's a lot better than saying, yeah, you know what, we're probably going to trade you, and having everyone freak out.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I thought of right when that came out. And I don't discount the report. Obviously, it makes me think back to PK Subban and Mark Bergevin. Like 2 days later, you're out the door. You were to the Nashville Predators. It's just what happens in the sports world. And I think maybe at that point in time, it was the right play by Brendan Shanahan. What can you tell us about your report from yesterday regarding the PA and Kyle Dubas' agent? What's the Coles notes of that story?
Yeah, so it's kind of an in the weeds, inside baseball type of story, but essentially there's been a number of agents that are certified by the NHLPA that have essentially, for lack of a better phrase, lodged a complaint with the PA, and now they're reviewing the fact that Kyle Dubas is represented by Chris Armstrong from Wasserman. He's in a separate arm and division of Wasserman, but he works at the same firm as the one that represents Austin Matthews among 70 other players in the NHL. And so the agents are sort of crying foul, saying, look, that's a no-go. That's been expressly prohibited from NHLPA regulations and meetings. I can't find anywhere, Nick, in the black and white that says that's the case. It says agents are prohibited from representing executives and GMs and coaches, but it doesn't say agencies. So I don't believe that anything nefarious has taken place. I believe Chris Armstrong is a longtime friend of Kyle Dubas and someone that agreed to represent him here. I think everything is sort of on the up and up in terms of it being an arm's length transaction. But when you get to the point that the NHLPA tells you that they're reviewing the matter, well, that's a story. And so Kyle Dubas also knows better that this would be perceived as a conflict of interest because he also knew all of these regulations and was subject to them as a former player agent. So I think Kyle Dubas knew better and probably should have, if he needed representation, picked someone else. But nonetheless, that's the spot that we're in now. I think the big thing is with a new regime in place in Marty Walsh at the NHLPA, is he going to put a stake in the ground? Is there going to be any sort of punishment? It wouldn't be towards Kyle Dubas. It wouldn't be towards Chris Armstrong. It would be towards Wasserman, which represents 71 NHL players, including some of the biggest stars in the game, Austin Matthews, Connor McDavid, Roman Josi, etc.
Any idea what a punishment like that would look like, Frank? Like that's the thing that came to my mind right away is like, what's the punishment if you're found guilty of that?
Well, I think, honestly, I don't know, but I would say one of the big things would be to change the regulation as well, that you can't have someone down the hall in your same office, representing someone on the other side of the table. And that's really the biggest issue for these other agencies that are complaining. It's not that they, essentially they do have issue with it, of course, but the idea is they're like, we keep our shop squeaky clean. Like we have a hockey division at our agency and we only represent hockey players. So we have other parts of our agency that represent coaches and media and all these other things, but we don't dabble in hockey executives and coaches. And frankly shouldn't be allowed to based on the information that could be traded back and forth in the horse trading. So they're saying, like, we don't do it. Many other places don't do it because that's what we believe the regulations to be. Why should Wasserman be any different?
Got it. Thank you for clearing that up. Last question before we let you go. Kyle Dubas, is this trending towards him being president GM in Pittsburgh?
If he wants it, I mean, that's the belief that I have and many others, is that the Pittsburgh Penguins are ready to turn the reins over. It sort of seems like the fact that they put their entire search on hold, and I've been in contact with, some of the people that have gone really deep in the process in Pittsburgh that feel like they're still in the mix, but have been told now they're in a holding pattern. And so when you see a search that was nearing its very final stages screech to a halt, that indicates that there's a preferred candidate elsewhere out there, and that would be Kyle Dubas. I think his stay in Pittsburgh earlier this week was short. I think one of the reasons why there's been a bit of a delay in the process has been because, for one, Kyle Dubas needs time to make up his mind. You heard him say just 10 days ago that he wouldn't be the guy that jumps back into hockey right away. I think that was all sort of blown out the window once the Leafs, essentially punted him, and now they're in a spot where Fenway Sports Group and their ownership, they're over at the Grand Prix in Monaco, having a great time on the yacht scene, and so I don't think they're kind of, everyone's waiting here. What's Kyle Dubas going to say? Because it seems like they want him for sure. The question is, does he want the Pittsburgh Penguins? To me, Nick, that job has never really made sense for Kyle Dubas. He's maybe one of the 2 or 3, executives in hockey that could have his pick of what's available. And to think that Pittsburgh, with all their best hockey behind them and a massive, painful rebuild coming, that would be the job that he chooses. But again, I don't know what else is being offered by Fenway Sports. Maybe that's a really attractive opportunity, as Kyle Dubas loves soccer and loves all these other, sports. Maybe he can have some sort of executive vice president of strategy where he has his hands in a whole bunch of different things that might get him really excited. I'm just spitballing, but maybe it's not on the surface just what it seems. So we'll see.